Hello, this video is going to cover the concepts that were touched upon on the 29th of February 2020, the Saturday class. So it's a repeat of that lesson. So if you remember, in the last class, we looked at capital budgeting techniques, and we looked at the calculations involved in capital budgeting techniques. Today, we are going to look at the last part of what you need to know in study unit 2. Not only do you need to know the calculations involved in capital budgeting techniques, but you also need to know some theory. So today I'm going to take you through some important theory that you need to know on capital budgeting techniques. Since the paper has been changed into a long paper where there are questions, it's important that you also know the theory behind the different capital budgeting techniques that we use, such that if a question comes in the exam and it's asking you to explain certain concepts, you can be able to explain them. And the study guide also says in any chapter, before you start doing too many calculations, you should always have a good understanding as to the theory involved behind the capital budgeting techniques or capital budgeting cash flows or whatever topic you're looking at. So what we're going to do, we will look at some, for today, firstly, we'll look at some basic terminology that's used when we are dealing with capital budgeting. Then after looking at some basic terminology you need to know, I will take you through the theory associated with the payback and the NPV, net present value. Then I'll also take you through theory on the profitability index, the PI, and the internal rate of return, the IRR. These are the techniques that I talked about in study unit 2. So I'll take you through these techniques. Please note, I gave you some questions to practice in the assignment. I think it was assignment question 2.1 and 2.2. You need to go through the calculations, and if you have any difficulty or you can't follow any of the calculations, you can let me know, and then I can give you assistance, whether through via WhatsApp or in the next class if you attend classes on Saturday. Okay, so it's just important for you to go through what I did and to see if you can follow. The assignment was just based on doing some calculations involving capital budgeting techniques. Lastly, I am going to look at comparing the net present value and internal rate of return. So this is what we covered on the 29th of February, and this is what I'm going to take you through today. I'll start by looking at some basic terminology involved in capital budgeting techniques. Then I'll talk about the payback, the theory behind the NPV, the theory behind the PI, the IRR. And then lastly, you need to know about comparing the NPV and IRR. These used to be very common questions when the paper was multiple choice, and I don't think there's any reason to think that these concepts will still not be asked now that the paper is clear. Okay, so let's get right into it, and let's start by looking at the basic terminology that you need to know in this chapter. Right. The first word that you'll see come up in capital budgeting techniques is the word independent projects. You'll see this come up, independent projects. Now, when we talk about independent projects, we are talking about projects which are not related to each other. We define these as, these are projects, capital projects. These are capital projects, not related to each other. So when we talk about independent projects, we're talking about projects which are not related to each other. Their cash flows do not affect each other. And what this means, it means that it's actually possible. It's possible for the company. It's possible for the company to choose more than one. It's possible for the company to choose more than one project. As long as the projects chosen, are profitable. Okay. So let me just explain this. Sometimes you might hear that projects are independent. You might hear that projects are independent. If we say that projects are independent, we mean that the projects we are considering, they are not related to each other. And what this means that if the company is trying to select projects to invest in, they are allowed to invest in these projects. They don't affect each other. They are allowed to invest in as many independent projects as they want, as long as the projects are profitable. As long as the projects are bringing money into the company, then the company is free to invest in as many independent projects as they want. And also as long as the company has sufficient money to invest in these projects. We can compare this with what we call mutually exclusive projects. Mutually exclusive projects. Mutually exclusive projects are the opposite of independent projects. Mutually exclusive projects are projects in which you can only choose one project. These are projects in which you can only choose one project. So these are projects in which you can only choose one project as long as the project is profitable. As long as the project is profitable. So mutually exclusive projects are the opposite of independent projects. Here you have some projects that you're trying to choose, but you are only allowed to choose one out of all the projects, as long as that project that you choose is profitable. So choosing one project automatically eliminates other projects. It means you're not allowed to choose more than one, but you can compare that with independent projects where you're allowed to choose more than one. So choosing one project automatically eliminates choosing one project eliminates other projects. Okay. So let me just give you an example of how a company would choose a project if they were mutually exclusive and if they were independent. Let me just give you an example to illustrate what we mean by independent projects and to illustrate what we mean by mutually exclusive projects. Okay, it's a simple example. Let's suppose that a company has through mutually exclusive projects. Let's say we're told a company has 3 mutually exclusive projects. We'll call these projects Project 1, Project 2, and Project 3. Project 1, Project 2, and Project 3. Let's say Project 1 has an NPV of 200,000 Rand. Project 2 has an NPV of 100,000 Rand. And Project 3 has an NPV of minus 50,000 Rand. If these projects are mutually exclusive, the company can only pick one project. And what the company will do, they'll pick the most profitable project. In this case, the most profitable project is Project 1. So the company would pick Project 1 as it is the most profitable. Okay. Whereas if these projects were independent, the company would be able to pick both projects, 1 and 2. Because with independent projects, you're allowed to pick more than one as long as the projects are profitable. So make sure you understand the distinction between independent projects and mutually exclusive projects. Okay. Next, the next terminology you need to know, which is C. A was independent project, B was mutually exclusive project. Next, let's look at the terminology unlimited funds. Unlimited funds. Sometimes you might see this written when you're dealing with capital budgeting. When the terminology unlimited funds is closely related to independent projects, the concepts of unlimited funds is closely related to independent projects. And we define unlimited funds as follows. A firm or a company has unlimited funds if they are able to accept all independent projects. If they are able to accept all independent profitable projects. So unlimited funds means you've got all the money that a company could need to invest in whatever it wants to invest in. So when we say that a company has unlimited funds, we mean that the company is able to accept all independent profitable projects. One, as long as the project is profitable and as long as the project is independent, the company is free to accept that project, right? And the opposite of unlimited funds is what we call capital rationing. The opposite of independent funds is what we call capital rationing. Sometimes we also say that the company has a capital constraint. Sometimes the company has capital rationing. This is sort of like a budget. It's the opposite to unlimited funds. When you have capital rationing, you can only invest in projects as long as their total cost is less than your budget. So we define this as, this is when the company has a fixed amount of money. This is when the company has a fixed amount of money and they can only accept a project or projects whose total investment is less than the fixed amount. And they can only accept a project or projects whose total investment is less than the fixed amount. Is less than the fixed amount. So it's in direct opposite to unlimited funds. In this case, you have a company and the company can only accept a project or projects whose total investment is less than the fixed amount. You are now operating with a budget. You're operating with a capital budget. Okay. The last two terminologies are also opposites. And I'll briefly talk about those two. As the video is going on, if you want to take notes, if you want to think about what I'm saying, you can pause the video and you can take your notes. So I'll be going a bit faster and wrapping this out. And then if you have any questions on anything I've talked about, you can communicate with me later via WhatsApp or in the next class. Right. The next two terminologies, the second last one is what we call the accept, reject approach. Now with the accept, reject approach, this occurs when we have a certain minimum standard that a project should have, and we accept all projects which meet the minimum standard, and we reject all projects which do not meet the minimum standard. So we say that this approach accepts projects that meet a certain minimum requirements. And rejects projects that do not meet that minimum requirement. And rejects projects that do not meet that minimum requirement. An important example of how this might actually work is in the case of the payback. The company might have a minimum target payback. For example, the company or a firm might only accept projects if their payback is less than, let's say, 3 years. So this is an example of the accept, reject approach. A company may only accept projects if they have a payback of less than 3 years. If they have a payback of less than 3 years. And the company might reject projects if they have a payback of more than 3 years. So that's an example of the accept reject approach. And they might reject projects with payback more than 3 years. So this is how the accept reject approach works. It can also work with NPV. The company might only accept projects with a positive NPV or with an NPV greater than a certain amount, and they might reject projects with an NPV which is less than a certain amount. Like they can accept as long as the NPV meets the minimum requirements, and they accept if the NPV of the project doesn't meet that minimum requirement. So that is the accept reject approach, right? The opposite to the accept reject approach when it comes to choosing projects is the ranking approach. So you see all these terminologies have an opposite approach to them. So it's important to just remember them in that way. So lastly, we have the ranking approach. This is the last terminology you need to know about, the ranking approach. And it's the opposite, sort of the opposite of the accept reject criteria. It's not directly an opposite, but it can be viewed as an opposite. Now, with the ranking approach, we are still trying to decide which projects, which capital projects to invest in. But this involves listing our projects from the best to the worst. This involves listing our projects from the best to the worst. And then we decide which projects to invest in based on the ranking that we've given to the project. So we list our projects from the best to the worst. For example, we have number 1, number 2, number 3, and then we choose our projects based on the ranking. So this involves listing our projects from the best to the worst, and we then choose our projects based on the ranking. Okay. So remember the basic terminology. Number 1, you have to know what independent projects are, what mutually exclusive projects are, what we mean by capital rationing, what we mean by unlimited funds, what we mean by the accept reject approach, and what we mean by the ranking approach. So that's the first part that was covered in the Saturday lesson. Okay. After that, we looked at some theory behind the different capital budgeting techniques, starting with the payback. So I'll now just take you through some theory involved in each of these capital budgeting techniques, starting with the payback. Then we'll look at the NPV. We'll look at the profitability index, internal rate of return. And then lastly, we'll compare the NPV and the IRR. Okay, so now let's look at some theory behind these capital budgeting techniques. Remember, last week we looked at how to calculate these techniques. So the lesson on Saturday touched on how to interpret these techniques, like the theory behind the techniques, which is very, very important. Okay. So we'll start by talking about the net present value. Sorry, the payback. We'll start by talking about the payback. So this is also known as the payback period. But for shorthand, when we're doing capital budgeting, we can just refer to it as the PB. So what the PB does, it gives us the number of years it takes for a company to recover its initial investment. This gives the number of years it takes for the company to recover the initial investment. For example, if we say that our payback is 2 years, it means it takes 2 years for the company to recover their initial investment from the capital project. If we say the payback of a capital project is 2 years, it means that it takes 2 years for the company to recover its initial investment from that particular capital project, right? And the way a company makes decisions based on the payback, the company accepts a project, a company or any organization, a company will accept a project if the payback of the project is less than a target for a hurdle payback. Usually the company will have a hurdle payback. So what the company will do, the company will accept a project if the payback of the project is less than a target or a hurdle payback. So for example, if the payback of a project is 2 years and the target is 1 year, e.g., let's say the payback of a project is 2 years and the target for the company is 1 year, the company will reject this project because 2 years is more than 1 year. So reject the project. As what we've calculated, the PB is more than the target. So that's how you make decisions based on the payback period. Now, the payback period has certain advantages and disadvantages, and these might also be asked in the exam, right? And I've seen with a lot of financial management courses, even for different institutes, if you later study your honors or you study with another institute, it's always important to know the advantages and disadvantages of the different capital budgeting techniques. And they might also be asked in this module. They are very easy to ask and to examine. So the payback period has some advantages, and the advantages and disadvantages are as follows. The advantages, and there's just one major disadvantage. The textbook also talks about this. The first advantage is that it's a simple technique to apply. Simple technique to apply. It's really simple to just do some calculations to see when your money will be required. And it's also simple to communicate to people. It's really simple to use. It doesn't involve too many complications. And also, yeah, it's a good measure of risk. It's a good measure of risk because it considers the timing of the cash flows. It's a good measure of risk because it considers the timing of the cash flows. It considers when you are actually getting your cash flows. So that's a good measure of risk. The major disadvantage is that it does not consider the time value of money. There's no discounting, there's no discount rates, and we know that the value of money 5 years from now isn't the same as the value of money today. It does not consider the time value of money. So this is a major disadvantage. Okay, we would want whatever capital budgeting technique we are using to consider the time value of money, because money is not worth the same today and in the future. Okay. So this is the first capital budgeting technique whose theory you need to know. The next capital budgeting technique whose theory you need to know is the net present value. And this is by far the most important capital budgeting technique, the net present value. I'll just give you some theory behind this one. Now, the net present value gives us the value that a project adds to a company. This approach gives us the value, the present value. It gives us the value, the present value that a project is adding to the company. This approach gives us the value, the present value that a project is adding to the company. Now, with our NPV, the basic idea behind the calculation is that we take the sum of the present value of all future cash inflows and we subtract the initial investment. When your financial calculator is doing this calculation for NPV, when you patch your numbers, what the calculator is actually doing to get the NPV, your calculator is summing sum of the present value of future cash inflows minus the initial investment. This is the way your calculator calculates NPV. It discounts all your future cash flows, adds them up, and then subtracts the initial investment. And then that gives you the net present value, also known as the NPV. And to calculate NPV, we use a discount rate. And this discount rate is also known as the cost of capital. In the next study units, the next topic, after study unit 3, we are going to look at how to calculate this cost of capital. But for now, just remember to calculate NPV. We use a discount rate. We use a discount rate known as the cost of capital. It's known as the cost of capital or the weighted average cost of capital. But this is the next topic, weighted average cost of capital. We're going to look at this in our next topic, the topic that has to do with cost of capital, weighted average cost of capital. But for now, let's say you want to calculate NPV or you want to calculate other capital budgeting techniques. Remember, if you're using a discount rate, if they say cost of capital or weighted average cost of capital, it means that you can use that cost of capital as your discount rate. Okay. The next thing you need to know about the NPV is when do we actually accept a project and when do we reject a project if we are working with the NPV. Now, if you remember, we said that a project is accepted if its NPV is greater than 0, because it means the project is adding value, is adding money to the company. Accept a project if NPV is greater than 0, and reject a project if NPV is less than 0. Yeah. The idea behind these two approaches is that we're accepting a project if NPV is greater than 0 because the project is adding value, is adding money to the company. And we're rejecting a project if NPV is less than 0, meaning it's negative. That means the project is taking money away from the company. Okay. The next capital budgeting technique is closely related to the NPV, and this is known as the profitability index. The profitability index. And the idea behind the profitability index, so this is very closely related to the NPV. These two always give you the same answer, very closely related to the NPV. So they give you the same answer, right? They'll always lead to you choosing the same project. That's what I mean. If you accept a project with an NPV, you'll definitely accept the project with the profitability index. So to calculate our profitability index, we use the following formula. We take the NPV of the project, we add the initial investment, and we divide by the initial investment. So this is the formula. Remember, BODMAS, you start with the top, then divide by the bottom. Please remember something important. Remember that we said that NPV is equals to PV of cash inflows minus initial investment, right? If we take initial investment to the other side, it means that NPV plus initial investment will give us the present value of cash inflows. So NPV plus initial investment, this is just the same as PV of cash inflows. So in a question, if they ask you to calculate the profitability index, and they give you the, if they ask you to calculate the profitability index and they give you the PV of cash inflows, you can use that as the top part of the calculation. So always be on the lookout for that in the exam. And we accept a project if the profitability index is greater than 1, and we reject a project if the profitability index is less than 1. 1. Okay. The last basic capital budgeting technique you need to know about is the internal rate of return, the internal rate of return. also known as the IRR, internal rate of return. Internal rate of return. Now, with the internal rate of return, this is a discount rate or the cost of capital. Remember, we said discount rate and cost of capital mean the same thing. This is the discount rate, or I can put this in brackets because they mean the same thing. Cost of capital. So this is the discount rate, meaning the cost of capital. That makes the NPV of a project equal to 0. Right. In simple terms, if you're asked to define the IRR, this is the discount rate, cost of capital that makes the NPV of a project equal to 0. And the NPV of a project depends on the discount rate that you use. Depends on the discount rate used. So someone might ask, why do we need to calculate the internal rate of return? How does it help us to make decisions? And what's the theory behind the internal rate of return? And the theory behind the internal rate of return is that the IRR is the cut-off discount rate. We can look at the IRR as the cut-off discount rate. This means if we calculate NPV using a discount rate more than the IRR, our NPV will be negative. And if we cut NPV, if we calculate NPV using an IRR, we're using a discount rate, which is less than the IRR, then our NPV will be positive. Okay, I'll repeat that. What this internal rate of return is telling us, it's telling us that if we calculate NPV, if we calculate the net present value using a discount rate that is higher than IRR, our NPV is going to be negative. And if we calculate NPV using a discount rate that is less than the IRR, our NPV will be positive. So the IRR can just help us to quickly make a decision on whether or not to invest in a project without having to do the NPV calculation. Okay, so this means if we calculate NPV using a discount rate greater than IRR, the NPV of the project will be negative. And the opposite is true. Like I said, if we calculate NPV using a discount rate less than the IRR, then the NPV of the project will be positive. So we can use the internal rate of return to easily make a decision as to whether or not to invest in a project, right? The way this works, let me give you an example of how this might apply in real life or in an exam question. You might have a company, and the company might look at a project. And after looking at the project, the company might calculate the internal rate of return of the project to be 11%, right? And then the company might then try to find out how they can raise money to finance this project. And let's say the money calculates the cost of capital, like they calculate how much interest they'll pay if they borrow money for this project. And let's say the company calculates this discount rate, this cost of capital, how much interest they'll pay on money that they put in the project. Let's say they calculate this to be 13%, the discount rate, the cost of capital to be 13%, right? 13% is more than the internal rate of return. So without even doing the NPV calculation, we can see that the discount rate is more than the internal rate of return. And this means NPV of the project will be negative. So that's how we use our IRR. Alternatively, let's assume that the discount rate, the cost that they are charged to borrow money, the cost of capital, they calculate it to be 9%. People will lend the money, say we'll charge you 9%. Then this is less than the IRR. And without even doing calculations for the NPV, we know that this means NPV of the project will be positive. So that's the idea behind this calculation, this technique. The idea is that if you use a discount rate greater than the IRR, you reject the project because your NPV will be negative. And if you use a discount rate less than the internal rate of return, you accept the project because your NPV will be, here we would reject because the NPV is negative, and here we would accept. So if discount rate is more than IRR, we reject. And if discount rate is less than IRR, we accept the project. The last thing you need to know in this section is with regards to comparing the net present value and the internal rate of return. You need to know about comparing the net present value and the internal rate of return. So this is the last part that we covered on Saturday. Comparing NPV and IRR. Right? These two, the NPV and IRR, they are the really popular techniques when it comes to capital budgeting. When a company wants to decide whether or not to invest in a project, the company will usually use one of these two techniques. So we just want to briefly compare them, and you need to know the theory behind comparing these two. And the problem is that the NPV and the IRR can sometimes give conflicting rankings. Sometimes, not all the time. Can sometimes give conflicting rankings. What do we mean by conflicting rankings? This means, for example, let's say we have two projects. This means, for example, let's say we have two projects, project A and B. Project A can have a higher NPV than project B. Right? But then, so you see, A is being said is better than B based on the NPV. Project A can have a higher NPV than project B. And project B can have a higher internal rate of return. Can have a higher IRR than project A. We call this conflict in ranking. We call this conflict in ranking because one project is being seen as better than the other project based on the NPV, but the IRR is saying another project is better than the other project. So this is called conflict in ranking. It's when two different techniques are ranking your two projects differently, right? And remember, when we're dealing with capital projects, the higher the NPV, the better, and the higher the internal rate of return, the better. We want our internal rate of return to be as high as possible, and we want our NPV to be as high as possible. So the conflict here is that the NPV of A is higher than the NPV of B, but the IRR of B is higher than the IRR of A. So this is conflict in ranking. So this can create a problem. If one analyst tries to choose a project based on the NPV and another analyst tries to choose a project based on the IRR, those two analysts can end up coming up with conflicting rankings. One party is saying one thing and the other party is saying another thing, right? The last thing we looked at on Saturday, we looked at two last things. We looked at why this conflict in ranking sometimes happens. And lastly, we discussed which approach is better to use. Let's say you have this conflict in ranking. Should we use the NPV or should we use the internal rate of return? Okay, so let's talk about the reasons for the conflict in ranking. Reasons for the conflict in ranking. Why does this sometimes happen? Reasons for conflict in ranking. The first reason why the NPV might give you a different ranking from the IRR is that we have a difference in the reinvestment assumption. We sometimes have a difference in the reinvestment assumption. What does this mean? This means the NPV correctly assumes that cash flows are reinvested at the discount rate. Correctly assumes that cash flows are reinvested at the cost of capital or the discount rate. This is correct. Whereas the NPV, the IRR, sorry, whereas the IRR incorrectly assumes cash flows are reinvested at the internal rate of return. The IRR incorrectly assumes that if we get cash coming back over the life of a project, we are reinvesting that cash at the internal rate of return. This is incorrect. Cash flows are actually reinvested at the cost of capital. So this is the reason why these two answers might give you different why these two approaches might give you different answers. This is the first reason. The second reason is the timing of cash flows. So the first one is the reinvestment assumption. The second reason for a conflict of ranking is the timing of cash flows. The timing of cash flows. If two projects have different timing of cash flows, there will be a conflict in ranking between IRR and NPV. If two projects have different timing in cash flows, there will be a conflict in ranking between the NPV and internal rate of return. Okay, what exactly does this mean? Here's an example. Let's say we have project A, and let's say we have project B, right? Let's look at these two projects. Let's say for project A, the initial investment is 200,000. Initial investment is 200,000. Let's say the same applies for project B. Its initial investment is 200,000. Year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's say, okay, 4 years. Let's say project A is a 4-year project. And after year 1, we get 10,000 Rand. After year 2, we get 50,000 Rand. After year 3, we get 150. And after year 4, we get 250. Project B, let's say with project B, year 1, we get 250. Year 2, 150. Year 3, 50. And year 4, 250. So year 4, we get 10,000. This is what we call a difference in the timing of cash flows. As you can see, the cash flows for project A start at 10,000 and they increase going up to 250. Whereas the cash flows for project B start at 250 and they go down to 10,000. So they both have the same cash flows, but the cash flows are occurring at different times. You'll find that the NPV might say peak project A, whereas the NPV of A will be higher than B, but you might find that the IRR of B is higher than A, or vice versa. So this is the second reason why there might be conflict in ranking. The third reason why there might be conflict in ranking, and this is the last reason actually, is the magnitude of the initial investment. The magnitude of the initial investment. Magnitude of the initial investment. If two projects have different initial investments, there might be a conflict in ranking. Two projects have a different initial investment. There might be a conflict in ranking. So one approach might say pick project A, another approach might say pick project B, and this might happen because of something like this. Project A might have, let's look at the initial investment. you might find that project A has an initial investment of 150,000 and project B has an initial investment of 20,000. If two projects have different initial investments like this, the NPV might give a different result and the IRR might give a different result. Those are big differences in the initial investment. Lastly, on Saturday, we looked at how to decide which technique to use. Let's say the NPV is giving you a different answer and the IRR is giving you a different answer. How do you decide finally which technique to actually use for your capital budgeting approach? How do you decide which technique to use? So the last thing we looked at, we briefly discussed about which approach is better. Which approach is actually better? Is it the NPV or the IRR? Which approach is better? Should we use, let's say the IRR is saying pick project A, NPV is saying pick project B. So which approach should you use? How do you decide? Okay, so this is the theory behind this. This is how we decide. The NPV is theoretically superior to the IRR. In theory, the NPV is theoretically superior to the IRR. This is because it gives us the wealth, the money a project is adding to the company. This is because it gives us the wealth a project is adding to the company. However, financial managers tend to prefer the IRR because they say it is easy to communicate. However, financial managers tend to prefer the IRR because they say it is easier to communicate. Financial managers tend to prefer the IRR because they say it is easier to communicate when you're talking to people who are not familiar with finance. But the NPV is theoretically superior. However, the IRR has a big limitation. The IRR has a big limitation. The IRR has a limitation in that it can give multiple answers when cash flows have a non-conventional pattern. In that it can give multiple answers. You might get 4 different internal rates of return, multiple answers, when cash flows have a non-conventional pattern. When cash flows have a non-conventional pattern. Please, when we say a non-conventional pattern, right? When we say that cash flows have a non-conventional pattern, we mean that money goes out. Let's say you spend money at the beginning, and then after spending money at the beginning, money comes back in from the project. When we have conventional cash flow patterns, money goes out and money comes in. That's conventional. That's what we've been looking at. But when we have non-conventional, money goes out, then maybe after 1 year, money comes in. Then after 2 years, maybe money goes out again. After 3 years, money comes back in. Okay, so with a non-conventional pattern, you have money going out, like you have a cash outflow before the end of a project. Let me just write out this through an example. This would be an example of a conventional cash flow pattern. Conventional cash flow pattern. You spend 100,000 rand in year 1. Year 2, you get 20,000. Year 3, 15,000. Okay, this is times 0 actually, times 0. And then year 1, year 2, year 3, you get 80,000. Year 4, you get 90,000. So this is conventional. This, on the other hand, is non-conventional. You spend 100,000. Yeah. Initial investment at time 0. You get 20,000 coming in. Year 1. Year 2, you spend 50,000. Year 3, you spend 15,000. Year 4, you get 150,000. So now here we have mixed cash inflows. We call this non-conventional. Here they are all positive, so we call this conventional. So if you have something like this, the IRR will not work. It will give you many different answers and it won't make sense when you're trying to make a decision. Okay. In conclusion, when these two approaches give you different answers, you should always use the NPV. When conflict of ranking occurs, conflict in ranking, occurs, use NPV. NPV is superior to the IRR because it's giving us the money that a project adds to the company. The last thing in this section, but we didn't cover this on Saturday, we'll cover this in the next lesson, is NPV profiles. They are what are known as NPV profiles. This is an important part of the study unit, so we didn't have enough time to cover this, but next time we'll cover NPV profiles, and then we'll look at risk and refinements in capital budgeting. Then we'll be able to start with the very second and important topic 2, which is cost of capital. So this is what we covered on Saturday. Thank you.